November 18, 1952. The Sea of Japan is a churning, slate-gray void beneath a ceiling of thick, blustery snow clouds. Somewhere within that freezing mist, four Grumman F-9 F-5 Panthers of Fighter Squadron 781 are clawing for altitude. They have just launched from the wooden deck of the USS Oriskany, their jet engines whistling a sharp, lonely note against the gale. Leading the second section is Lieutenant Elmer Royce Williams, a man whose name will remain a ghost in the official archives for the next half-century. As the Panthers punch through the overcast at 12,000 feet, the world suddenly shifts from blinding white to a piercing, deep blue clarity. But the beauty of the stratosphere is short-lived. High above them, carved into the thin air at 50,000 feet, are 7 distinct white scars, the contrails of the enemy. These are not North Korean recruits. They are elite Soviet pilots flying the MiG-15, a swept-wing interceptor that is, on paper, a generation ahead of the straight-wing Panther. The tension in the cockpit is broken by a mechanical failure. The division leader, Lieutenant Claire Elwood, reports a fuel pump warning light and is ordered to break off. His wingman follows him back to the carrier, instantly slashing the American presence in half. Now, it is only Williams and his wingman, Dave Rowlands, hanging between the task force and 7 descending Predators. The MiG split, diving out of the sun with a combined speed exceeding Mach 1. Williams doesn't hesitate. He flips his master arm switch and fires a short test burst from his 4 20mm cannons. In a matter of seconds, Rowlands will lose contact in the swirling chaos, leaving Williams entirely alone against 7 of the fastest aircraft on the planet. What follows is not a skirmish, but a 35-minute test of human endurance and mechanical resilience, the longest dogfight in the history of the United States Navy. To understand the gravity of the situation Elmer Royce Williams found himself in, one must look at the stark technological divide between the two combatants. The Grumman F-9 F-5 Panther was a rugged, reliable machine, but it was essentially a straight-wing design born of late 1940s philosophy. While it was the Navy's first successful carrier-based jet fighter, it struggled with limited transonic performance. Its 4 20mm M3 cannons were potent, but the airframe itself was outmatched in almost every aerodynamic metric by the Soviet Union's crown jewel, the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-15. The MiG-15 was a revelation of Cold War engineering. Featuring a 35-degree swept-wing design and powered by the Klimov VK-1 engine, a reverse-engineered British Rolls-Royce Nene, it was faster, could climb more steeply, and possessed a much higher service ceiling than the Panther. In the thin air of 50,000 feet, the MiG-15 was in its element, while the Panther felt heavy and sluggish. Furthermore, the MiG carried a terrifying armament, 2 23mm cannons and a single massive 37mm cannon, specifically designed to shred heavy American bombers like the B-29. A single hit from the 37mm shell could effectively end the flight of a fighter as small as the F-9F. This was the techno-thriller reality of the early 1950s. The Americans were relying on pilot training and gunnery to compensate for a widening gap in airframe performance. Williams knew that if he tried to outclimb the MiGs, he would be picked off as he stalled in the rarefied atmosphere. If he tried to run, they would simply dive and catch him with their superior Mach limit. His only hope was to stay in a turning fight at lower altitudes, where the Panther's stable handling might allow him to outmaneuver the more temperamental Soviet jets. As the 7 Soviet pilots spiraled down from the sun, they likely expected an easy kill. They were part of a secret Soviet deployment, wearing North Korean uniforms and using Chinese markings to maintain the fiction of non-involvement. But their tactics were pure Soviet doctrine. They operated in pairs or elements, using high-speed yo-yo maneuvers to keep the slower American pinned down. As the first pair of MiGs leveled their wings to begin their firing run, Williams pulled his stick hard to the left, feeling the heavy G-loads press him into his seat, and began a dance with death that would defy the laws of probability. The first pair of MiGs came in from the rear, the high-pitched whine of their engines swallowed by the roar of the wind. Williams, acting on instinct honed through thousands of flight hours, didn't turn away. He turned into them. By narrowing the angle of the attack, he forced the Soviet pilots to compensate for a high-deflection shot, a difficult feat even for seasoned veterans. As the lead MiG-15 overshot his wing, Williams found a fleeting moment of alignment. He squeezed the trigger. A stream of 20mm shells erupted from the Panther's nose, stitching a path across the Soviet jet's fuselage. The MiG shuddered, lost its aerodynamic profile, and began a slow, terminal spiral toward the frigid sea below. But there was no time to track the kill. Even as the first MiG fell, the remaining 6 repositioned. Williams was now in a fight for his life, operating at the very edge of the Panther's performance envelope. He was constantly pulling between 3 and 5 GS, his vision narrowing as the blood drained from his brain. The Soviet pilots, perhaps stunned by the loss of their wingman to a technically inferior aircraft, became more aggressive. They abandoned their disciplined formation and began a series of uncoordinated lunges, each pilot vying for the glory of downing the lone American. This lack of coordination was Williams' only advantage. In the chaotic furball, he was able to keep the MiGs from ever getting a clean, sustained look at him. Every time a MiG-15 attempted to settle its gun sight on the Blue Panther, Williams would snap the plane into a violent roll or a tight, shuddering turn. He was using every ounce of his aircraft's structural integrity. The F-9F-5 was known for being overbuilt, a trait common to Grumman aircraft that earned them the nickname the Iron Works. This durability was about to be tested as the 37mm cannons of the Soviet jets began to find their range. Williams was essentially performing a solo ballet in the stratosphere. He was outturning the MiGs at low speeds, where the swept-wing Soviet jets became unstable and prone to stalling. However, his ammunition was a finite resource. Each burst of his 20mm cannons had to be calculated. He was not just fighting for a kill anymore. He was fighting for the seconds of life that each defensive maneuver bought him. Behind him, he could see the streaks of tracer fire, large, glowing orbs of 37mm shells, missing his cockpit by mere feet. The realization was sinking in. He had survived the first 5 minutes, but 30 more lay ahead of him, and his aircraft was already beginning to scream under the strain of the metal-on-metal violence. As the engagement stretched beyond the 20-minute mark, the physical and mental exhaustion began to manifest as a dull ache in Williams' limbs, yet his focus remained razor-sharp. He had already downed 1 MiG, but the remaining 6 were no longer underestimating the blue-painted jet. In a daring cross-turn, Williams caught a second Soviet fighter in his sights, leading the target perfectly. A brief, 1-second burst was all it took. The MiG-15 erupted in a ball of fire, its pilot unable to eject as the aircraft disintegrated. Now, the odds were 5-1. The Soviet flight leader, frustrated by the Americans' persistence, ordered a pincer movement. As Williams banked to avoid a head-on pass, a third MiG swept across his nose. He fired his remaining 20mm ammunition, seeing the shells spark against the silver wing of the enemy before it veered away, trailing a thick plume of black smoke. With his ammunition counters nearing 0, Williams was now essentially flying a defenseless target. It was during this desperate maneuver that the inevitable happened. A Soviet pilot, staying high and waiting for an opening, dove into Williams' 6 o'clock position and unleashed a barrage from his 37mm cannon. A massive explosion rocked the Panther. The heavy shell struck the rear of the aircraft, tearing through the rudder and severing the hydraulic lines that controlled the elevator. In an instant, the F-9F-5 lost its primary flight controls. The aircraft began to buffet violently, pitching upward as if to stall. Williams slammed the stick forward, but there was no response. The connection between the cockpit and the tail was a mangled ruin of steel and fluid. This was the moment where the Grumman Iron Works reputation saved a life. Despite the catastrophic damage, the Panther's airframe did not snap. Williams discovered that by using the manual backup cables and varying his engine thrust, he could maintain a precarious level of control. He was now flying at a lower altitude, barely above the whitecaps of the Sea of Japan, with 4 MiGs still circling him like sharks. He was out of ammunition, his jet was a flying sieve, and he was still miles away from the safety of the task force. The Soviet pilots, perhaps low on fuel or unnerved by the sight of a shattered plane that refused to die, began to pull away. Williams was alone in the cockpit, drenched in sweat and adrenaline, nursing a crippled machine toward a carrier deck that was pitching in a winter storm. The retreat of the Soviet fighters did not signal an end to the peril. It only shifted the nature of the crisis from combat to survival. Williams was now flying a perforated shell of an aircraft. With the hydraulic fluid gone, the Panther was essentially a deadweight, kept aloft only by the pilot's brute force and the mechanical backup cables that bypassed the severed power systems. As he limped toward the coordinates of the task force, a new threat emerged: friendly fire. The radar operators on the USS Oriskany and its escorting destroyers were on high alert, having tracked the massive aerial engagement on their screens. To them, any aircraft approaching from the north at high speed was a potential suicide attacker or a Soviet strike leader. Williams had no functional identification friend or foe system left to signal his identity. Fortunately, his wingman, Dave Rowlands, managed to relocate the crippled Panther and pull alongside. Rowlands was horrified by what he saw. The tail section of Williams' jet was shredded. The skin of the fuselage was peeled back in jagged strips, and the engine was emitting a sickly, rhythmic thrum. Rowlands radioed the carrier, identifying the incoming wreckage as a friendly. Even so, the landing would be a gamble. Because the hydraulic system was non-functional, Williams could not lower his flaps or his dive brakes. This meant he would have to land the Panther at a speed of approximately 170 knots, nearly 40 knots faster than the standard carrier approach. If he missed the arresting wires, the aircraft would likely plow through the barricade and into the parked planes on the bow. The Oriskany's captain, sensing the desperation of the situation, ordered the ship to turn directly into the wind, maximizing the headwind to slow Williams' relative ground speed. As the Blue Panther crossed the round down of the flight deck, Williams kept his nose high, fighting the aircraft's tendency to pitch violently. He hit the deck hard. The tailhook caught the number 3 wire, and the massive tension of the arresting gear jerked the aircraft to a screaming halt. For the first time in 35 minutes, the roar of the wind and the engine died away, replaced by the frantic shouts of the deck crew rushing toward the smoking machine. Williams sat in the cockpit, his hands frozen to the controls, unable to move until the emergency crews pried the canopy open. The deck crew of the USS Oriskany stood in stunned silence as they circled the battered remains of the F-9F-5 Panther. A detailed post-flight inspection revealed the terrifying scale of the violence Williams had endured. The aircraft had been struck by no fewer than 263 separate projectiles. While most were 23mm hits, the jet also bore the catastrophic scars of the Soviet 37mm rounds that had narrowly missed the cockpit but shredded the engine and tail assembly. The damage was so absolute that the mechanical crew didn't even attempt a repair. After stripping the jet of its sensitive camera equipment and usable instruments, they pushed the historic airframe over the side of the carrier and into the deep, lightless waters of the Sea of Japan. Despite the magnitude of his feat, single-handedly downing at least 4 Soviet MiGs in one of the most intense aerial duels of the century, the response from the highest levels of the Pentagon was immediate and suppressive. Admiral Robert Briscoe personally informed Williams that while his actions were heroic, they could never be acknowledged. In the fragile political landscape of 1952, the United States feared that admitting a direct, lethal engagement between American and Soviet pilots would provide the spark for a Third World War. For over 50 years, Elmer Royce Williams remained a silent witness to his own history, his flight logs classified and his story hidden even from his closest family members. It was only in the early 21st century, following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the subsequent declassification of Russian archives, that the full scale of the encounter was confirmed. Soviet records officially documented the loss of 4 aircraft during that engagement, piloted by some of their most decorated airmen. In January 2023, at the age of 97, Royce Williams was finally awarded the Navy Cross, the service's second highest honor for valor in combat. His survival remains a definitive testament to the grit of a generation of pilots and the rugged engineering of the Iron Works machines that carried them. If you found this deep dive into Cold War history compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel to ensure you never miss our deep dives into the untold stories of military technology and doctrine.